come, little children, oh come, one and all, to Bethlehem's stable in Bethlehem's stall.
Welcome to the 10th day of CraftLit, our 12-day Christmas story extravaganza. Today, on our 10th day, I bring you humor, and plenty of it. We have one story called The Christmas Eve Burglary, which sounds like it could be a P.G. Wodehouse story. Our second text is called The Thin Santa Claus. It's from 1908. And if you listened to Biscuit Ex Machina, which was one of the stories that we had on the premium feed a while ago and is now in the shop, which you can get to from craftlit.com. If you remember Biscuits Ex Machina, you might recall that there was one joke at the very end of the story that hinged on knowing who Mr. Dooley was. There was an Irish-American writer in Chicago back when Teddy Roosevelt was in office, and he wrote colloquial humor. So he used dialect and put into the mouths of people who were speaking in this dialect wisdom that you probably couldn't get away with saying if you weren't saying it like it was a joke. And that included insulting the president. And Teddy Roosevelt used to read this guy's articles in the paper every week. He'd bring them to his cabinet meetings and read these stories that were making fun of him. And he thought they were hilarious. And eventually these two guys met and they went off like gangbusters. They stayed friends, I think, until the end of their lives, if I recall correctly. Anyway, you will hear some similarities to the story, The Thin Santa Claus and Mr. Dooley. And our last bit is by an author I've never heard of before. I couldn't find any information on him. It is called The Christmas Present Assurance Company. It is from the 1890s. It is about as modern a text as I have ever come across. And we've hit some that felt pretty darn modern. This one blows them all out of the water. I am so happy to be able to bring this to you. So, 3 fun stories for our 10th day. Here we go.
The Christmas Eve Burglary by Arnold Bennett. Lady Dane said, "Gee, if that portrait stays there much longer, you'll just have to take me off to Pyre Hill one of these fine mornings." Pyre Hill is the seat of the great local hospital, but it is also the seat of the great local lunatic asylum, and when the inhabitants of the Five Towns say merely Pyre Hill, they mean the asylum. "I do declare I can't fancy my food nowadays," said Lady Dane, "and it's all that portrait." She stared plaintively up at the immense oil painting which faced her as she sat at the breakfast table in her spacious and opulent dining room. Sir Jehosephat made no remark. Despite Lady Dane's animadversions upon it, despite the undoubted fact that it was generally disliked in the Five Towns, the portrait had cost £1,000, some said guineas, and though not yet 2 years old, it was probably worth at least 1,500 in the picture market. For it was a Cresage, and not only was it a Cresage, it was one of the finest Cresages in existence. It marked the summit of Sir Jehosaphat's career. Sir Jehosaphat's career was perhaps the most successful and brilliant in the entire social history of the Five Towns. This famous man was the principal partner in Dane Brothers. His brother was dead, but 2 of Sir G.'s sons were in the firm. Dane Brothers were the largest manufacturers of cheap earthenware in the district, catering chiefly for the American and colonial buyer. They had an extremely bad reputation for cutting prices. They were hated by every other firm in the Five Towns, and to hear rival manufacturers talk, one would gather the impression that Sir G. had acquired a tremendous fortune by systematically selling goods under cost. They were also hated by between 1,800 and 1,900 employees. But such hatred, however virulent, had not marred the progress of Sir G.'s career. He had meant to make a name, and he had made it. The Five Towns might laugh at his vulgar snobbishness. The Five Towns might sneer at his calculated philanthropy. But he was, nevertheless, the best-known man in the Five Towns, and it was precisely his snobbishness and his philanthropy which had carried him to the top. Moreover, he had been the first public man in the Five Towns to gain a knighthood. The Five Towns could not deny that it was very proud indeed of this knighthood. The means by which he had won this distinction were neither here nor there. He had won it. And was he not the father of his native borough? Had he not been 3 times mayor of his native borough? Was not the whole northern half of the county dotted and spangled by his benefactions, his institutions, his endowments? And it could not be denied that he sometimes tickled the Five Towns as the Five Towns likes being tickled. There was, for example, the notorious Sneyd incident. Sneyd Hall, belonging to the Earl of Chell, lies a few miles south of the Five Towns, and from it the pretty Countess of Chell exercises that condescending meddlesomeness which so frequently exasperates the Five Towns. Sir G. had got his title by the aid of the Countess, interfering Iris, as she is locally dubbed. Shortly afterwards he had contrived to quarrel with the Countess, and the quarrel was conducted by Sir G. as a quarrel between equals, which delighted the district. Sir G.'s final word in it had been to buy a sizable tract of land near Sneyd village, just off the Sneyd estate, and to erect thereon a mansion quite as imposing as Sneyd Hall and far more up to date, and to call the mansion Sneyd Castle. A mighty stroke. Iris was furious, the Earl speechless with fury, but they could do nothing. Naturally, the Five Towns was tickled. It was apropos of the housewarming of Sneyd Castle, also of the completion of his 3rd mayoralty and of the inauguration of the Dane Technical Institute, that the movement had been started, primarily by a few toadies, for tendering to Sir G. a popular gift worthy to express the profound esteem in which he was officially held in the Five Towns. It having been generally felt that the gift should take the form of a portrait, a local dilettante had suggested Cresage, and when the Five Towns had inquired into Cresage and discovered that that genius from the United States was celebrated throughout the civilized world and regarded as the equal of Velasquez, whoever Velasquez might be, and that he had painted half the aristocracy and that his income was regal, the suggestion was accepted and Cresage was approached. Cresage haughtily consented to paint Sir G.'s portrait on his usual conditions, namely that the sitter should go to the little village in Bedfordshire where Cresage had his principal studio, and that the painting should be exhibited at the Royal Academy before being shown anywhere else. Cresage was an R.A., but no one thought of putting R.A. after his name. He was so big that instead of the Royal Academy conferring distinction on him, he conferred distinction on the Royal Academy. Sir G. went to Bedfordshire and was rapidly painted, and he came back gloomy. The presentation committee went to Bedfordshire later to inspect the portrait, and they too came back gloomy. Then the Academy exhibition opened, and the portrait, showing Sir G. in his robe and chain and in a chair, was instantly hailed as possibly the most glorious masterpiece of modern times. All the critics were of one accord. The committee and Sir G. were reassured, but only partially, and Sir G. rather less so than the committee. For there was something in the enthusiastic criticisms which gravely disturbed them. An enlightened generation, thoroughly familiar with the dazzling yearly succession of Cresage's portraits, need not be told what this something was. One critic wrote that Cresage displayed even more than his "customary astounding insight into character." Another critic wrote that Cresage's observation was, as usual, "calmly and coldly hostile." Another referred to the "typical provincial mayor, immortalized for the diversion of future ages." Inhabitants of the Five Towns went to London to see the work for which they had subscribed, and they saw a mean little old man, with thin lips and a straggling grey beard and shifty eyes, and "Pushful Snob" written all over him, ridiculous in his gewgaws of office. When you looked at the picture close to, it was a meaningless mass of coloured smudges, but when you stood 15 feet away from it, the portrait was absolutely lifelike, amazing, miraculous. It was so wondrously lifelike that some of the inhabitants of the Five Towns burst out laughing. Many people felt sorry, not for Sir G., but for Lady Dane. Lady Dane was beloved and genuinely respected. She was a simple, homely, sincere woman, her one weakness being that she had never been able to see through Sir G. Of course, at the presentation ceremony the portrait had been ecstatically referred to as a possession precious for ever, and the recipient and his wife pretended to be overflowing with pure joy in the ownership of it. It had been hanging in the dining room of Sneyd Castle about 16 months when Lady Dane told her husband that it would ultimately drive her into the lunatic asylum. "Don't be silly, wife," said Sir G. "I wouldn't part with that portrait for 10 times what it cost." This was, to speak bluntly, a downright lie. Sir G. secretly hated the portrait more than anyone hated it. He would have been almost ready to burn down Sneyd Castle in order to get rid of the thing. But it happened that on the previous evening, in conversation with the magistrate's clerk, his receptive brain had been visited by a less expensive scheme than burning down the castle. Lady Dane sighed. "Are you going to town early?" she inquired. "Yes," he replied. "I'm on the rota to-day." He was chairman of the Borough Bench of Magistrates. As he drove into town he revolved his scheme, and thought it wild and dangerous, but still feasible. 2. On the bench that morning, Sir G. shocked Mr. Sherratt, the magistrate's clerk, and he utterly disgusted Mr. Bourne, superintendent of the borough police. I do not intend to name the name of the borough, whether Bursley, Hanbridge, Knype, Longshore, or Turnhill. The inhabitants of the Five Towns will know without being told. The rest of the world has no right to know. There had recently occurred a somewhat thrilling series of burglaries in the district, and the burglars, a gang of them was presumed, had escaped the solicitous attentions of the police. But on the previous afternoon an underling of Mr. Bourne's had caught a man who was generally believed to be wholly or partly responsible for the burglaries. The Five Towns breathed with relief and congratulated Mr. Bourne, and Mr. Bourne was well pleased with himself. The Staffordshire Signal headed the item of news, "Smart capture of a supposed burglar." The supposed burglar gave his name as William Smith, and otherwise behaved in an extremely suspicious manner. Now Sir G., sitting as chief magistrate in the police court, actually dismissed the charge against the man. Overruling his sole colleague on the bench that morning, Alderman Easton, he dismissed the charge against William Smith, holding that the evidence for the prosecution was insufficient to justify even a remand. No wonder that Mr. Bourne was discouraged, not to say angry. No wonder that that pillar of the law, Mr. Sherratt, was pained and shocked. At the conclusion of the case, Sir Jehosephat said that he would be glad to speak with William Smith afterwards in the magistrate's room, indicating that he sympathised with William Smith and wished to exercise upon William Smith his renowned philanthropy. And so, at about noon, when the court majestically rose, Sir G. retired to the magistrate's room, where the humble Alderman Easton was discreet enough not to follow him, and awaited William Smith. And William Smith came, guided thither by a policeman, to whom, in parting from him, he made a rude, surreptitious gesture. Sir G., seated in the armchair which dominates the other chairs round the elm table in the magistrate's room, emitted a preliminary cough.
Smith,
he said sternly, leaning his elbows on the table,
you were very fortunate this morning, you know.
And he gazed at Smith. Smith stood near the door, cap in hand. He did not resemble a burglar, who surely ought to be big, muscular, and masterful. He resembled an undersized clerk who has been out of work for a long time, but who has nevertheless found the means to eat and drink rather plenteously. He was clothed in a very shabby navy blue suit, frayed at the wrists and ankles, and greasy in front. His linen collar was brown with dirt, his fingers were dirty, his hair was unkempt and long, and a young and lusty black beard was sprouting on his chin. His boots were not at all pleasant.
Yes, Governor,
Smith replied lightly, with a Manchester accent.
And what's your game?
Sir G. was taken aback. He, the chairman of the borough bench and the leading philanthropist in the county, to be so spoken to. But what could he do? He himself had legally established Smith's innocence. Smith was as free as air, and had a perfect right to adopt any tone he chose to any man he chose. And Sir G. desired a service from William Smith.
I was hoping I might be of use to you,
said Sir Jehosephat diplomatically.
Well, said Smith, that's all right, that is, but none of your philanthropic dodges, you know. I don't want to lead a new life, and I don't want to turn over a new leaf, and I don't want a helping hand, nor none of those things. And what's more, I don't want a situation. I've got all the situation as I need. But I never refuse money, nor beer neither. Never did, and I'm 40 years old next month. I suppose burgling doesn't pay very well, does it?
Sir G. boldly ventured. William Smith laughed coarsely.
It pays right enough, said he, but I don't put my money on my back, Governor. I put it into a bit of public-house property when I get the chance. It may pay, said Sir G., but it is wrong. It is very anti-social. Is it, indeed?
Smith returned dryly.
Anti-social, is it? Well, I've heard it called plenty of things in my time, but never that. Now, I should have called it quite sociable-like, sort of making free with strangers and so on. However, he added, I come across a cove once as told me crime was nothing but a disease and ought to be treated as such. I asked him for a dozen of port, but he never sent it. Ever been caught before?
Sir G. inquired.
Not much,
Smith exclaimed.
And this'll be a lesson to me, I can tell you. Now, what are you getting at, Governor? Because my time's money, my time is.
Sir G. coughed once more.
Sit down,
said Sir G. And William Smith sat down opposite to him at the table, and put his shiny elbows on the table precisely in the manner of Sir G.'s elbows. Well, he cheerfully encouraged Sir G.
How should you like to commit a burglary that was not a crime?
Said Sir G., his shifty eyes wandering around the room.
A perfectly lawful burglary. What are you getting at?
William Smith was genuinely astonished.
At my residence, Sneyd Castle, Sir G. proceeded, there's a large portrait of myself in the dining-room that I want to have stolen. You understand?
Stolen?
Yes, I want to get rid of it, and I want people to think that it has been stolen.
Well, why don't you stop up one night and steal it yourself and then burn it? William Smith suggested.
That would be deceitful,
said Sir G. gravely.
I could not tell my friends that the portrait had been stolen if it had not been stolen. The burglary must be entirely genuine.
What's the figure? Said Smith curtly.
Figure?
What are you going to give me for the job?
Give you for doing the job?
Sir G. repeated, his secret and ineradicable meanness aroused.
Give you? Why, I'm giving you the opportunity to honestly steal a picture that's worth over £1,000. I dare say it would be worth £2,000 in America. And you want to be paid into the bargain? Do you know, my man, that people come all the way from Manchester and even London to see that portrait?
He told Smith about the painting. Then why are you in such a stew to be rid of it? Queried the burglar.
That's my affair,
said Sir G.
I don't like it. Lady Dane doesn't like it. But it's a presentation portrait, and so I can't... You see, Mr. Smith?
And how am I going to dispose of it when I've got it? Smith demanded.
You can't melt a portrait down as if it was silver.
By what you say, Governor, it's known all over the blessed world. Seems to me I might just as well try to sell the Nelson column.
Oh, nonsense,
said Sir G.
Nonsense. You'll sell it in America quite easily. It'll be a fortune to you. Keep it for a year first, and then send it to New York.
William Smith shook his head and drummed his fingers on the table, and then, quite suddenly, he brightened and said,
All right, Governor, I'll take it on, just to oblige you. When can you do it?
Asked Sir G., hardly concealing his joy.
Tonight?
No, said Smith mysteriously.
I'm engaged tonight. Well, tomorrow night?
No, tomorrow. I'm engaged tomorrow, too.
You seem to be very much engaged, my man, Sir G. observed.
What do you expect? Smith retorted. Business is business. I could do it the night after tomorrow.
But that's Christmas Eve, Sir G. protested.
What if it is Christmas Eve? Said Smith coldly. Would you prefer Christmas Day? I'm engaged on Boxing Day and the day after.
Not in the Five Towns, I trust, Sir G. remarked.
No, said Smith shortly. The Five Towns is about so dry. The affair was arranged for Christmas Eve.
Now, Sir G. suggested, shall I draw you a plan of the castle so that you can...
William Smith's face expressed terrific scorn. Do you suppose, he said, as I haven't had plans of your castle ever since it was built? What do you take me for? I'm not a bloomin' excursionist, I'm not. I'm a businessman, that's what I am. Sir G. was snubbed, and he agreed submissively to all William Smith's arrangements for the innocent burglary. He perceived that in William Smith he had stumbled on a professional of the highest class, and this good fortune pleased him. There's only one thing that riles me, said Smith in parting, and that is that you'll go and say that after you'd done everything you could for me, I went and burgled your castle, and you'll talk about the ingratitude of the lower classes. I know you, Governor. 3. On the afternoon of the 24th of December, Sir Jehosephat drove home to Sneyd Castle from the principal of the 3 Dane manufactories, and found Lady Dane superintending the work of packing up trunks. He and she were to quit the castle that afternoon in order to spend Christmas on the other side of the Five Towns under the roof of their eldest son John, who had a new house, a new wife, and a new baby, male. John was a domineering person, and being rather proud of his house and all that was his, he had obstinately decided to have his own Christmas at his own hearth. Grandpapa and Grandmamma, drawn by the irresistible attraction of that novelty, a grandson, though Mrs. John had declined to have the little thing named Jehosephat, had yielded to John's solicitations, and the family gathering, for the first time in history, was not to occur round Sir G.'s mahogany. Sir G. very characteristically said nothing to Lady Dane immediately. He allowed her to proceed with the packing of the trunks, and then tea was served, and the time was approaching for the carriage to come round to take them to the station, when at last he suddenly remarked,
"I shan't be able to go with you to John's this afternoon."
"Oh, G!" she exclaimed. "Really, you are tiresome. Why couldn't you tell me before?"
"I will come over to-morrow morning, perhaps in time for church," he proceeded, ignoring her demand for an explanation. He always did ignore her demand for an explanation. Indeed, she only asked for explanations in a mechanical and perfunctory manner. She had long since ceased to expect them. Sir G. had been born like that, devious, mysterious, incalculable, and Lady Dane accepted him as he was. She was somewhat surprised, therefore, when he went on, "I have some minutes of committee meetings that I really must go carefully through and send off to-night, and you know as well as I do there'll be no chance of doing that at John's. I've telegraphed to John."
He was obviously nervous and self-conscious. "There's no food in the house," sighed Lady Dane, "and the servants are all going away except Callear, and he can't cook your dinner to-night. I think I'd better stay myself and look after you."
"You'll do no such thing,"
said Sir G. decisively.
"As for my dinner, anything will do for that. The servants have been promised their holiday, to start from this evening, and they must have it. I can manage."
Here spoke the philanthropist with his unshakable sense of justice. So Lady Dane departed, anxious and worried, having previously arranged something cold for Sir G. in the dining-room, and instructed Callear about boiling the water for Sir G.'s tea on Christmas morning. Callear was the under-coachman and a useful odd man. He it was who would drive Sir G. to the station on Christmas morning, and then guard the castle and the stables thereof during the absence of the family and the other servants. Callear slept over the stables. And after Sir G. had consumed his cold repast in the dining-room, the other servants went, and Sir G. was alone in the castle, facing the portrait. He had managed the affair fairly well, he thought. Indeed, he had a talent for chicane, and none knew it better than himself. It would have been dangerous if the servants had been left in the castle. They might have suffered from insomnia and heard William Smith, and interfered with the operations of William Smith. On the other hand, Sir G. had no intention whatever of leaving the castle uninhabited to the mercies of William Smith. He felt that he himself must be on the spot to see that everything went right and that nothing went wrong. Thus the previously arranged scheme for the servants' holiday fitted perfectly into his plans, and all that he had had to do was to refuse to leave the castle till the morrow. It was ideal. Nevertheless, he was a little afraid of what he had done and of what he was going to permit William Smith to do. It was certainly dangerous, certainly rather a wild scheme. However, the die was cast, and within 12 hours he would be relieved of the intolerable incubus of the portrait. And when he thought of the humiliations which that portrait had caused him, when he remembered the remarks of his sons concerning it, especially John's remarks, when he recalled phrases about it in London newspapers, he squirmed and told himself that no scheme for getting rid of it could be too wild and perilous. And, after all, the burglary dodge was the only dodge, absolutely the only conceivable practical method of disposing of the portrait, except burning down the castle. And surely it was preferable to a conflagration, to arson. Moreover, in case of fire at the castle, some blundering fool would be sure to cry, "The portrait! The portrait must be saved!" And the portrait would be saved. He gazed at the repulsive, hateful thing. In the centre of the lower part of the massive gold frame was the legend, "Presented to Sir Jehosephat Dane, Knight, as a mark of public esteem and gratitude," etc. He wondered if William Smith would steal the frame. It was to be hoped that he would not steal the frame. In fact, William Smith would find it very difficult to steal that frame unless he had an accomplice or so.
"This is the last time I shall see you,"
said Sir G. to the portrait. Then he unfastened the catch of one of the windows in the dining-room, as per contract with William Smith, turned out the electric light, and went to bed in the deserted castle. He went to bed, but not to sleep. It was no part of Sir G.'s programme to sleep. He intended to listen, and he did listen. And about 2:00, precisely the hour which William Smith had indicated, he fancied he heard muffled and discreet noises. Then he was sure that he heard them. William Smith had kept his word. Then the noises ceased for a period, and then they recommenced. Sir G. restrained his curiosity as long as he could, and when he could restrain it no more, he rose and silently opened his bedroom window and put his head out into the nipping night air of Christmas. And by good fortune he saw the vast oblong of the picture, carefully enveloped in sheets, being passed by a couple of dark figures through the dining-room window to the garden outside. William Smith had a colleague then, and he was taking the frame as well as the canvas. Sir G. watched the men disappear down the avenue, and they did not reappear. Sir G. returned to bed.
Yes, he felt himself equal to facing it out with his family and friends. He felt himself equal to pretending that he had no knowledge of the burglary.
Having slept a few hours, he got up early and, half-dressed, descended to the dining-room, just to see what sort of a mess William Smith had made. The canvas of the portrait lay flat on the hearthrug, with the following words written on it in chalk: "This is no use to me." It was the massive gold frame that had gone. Further, as was later discovered, all the silver had gone. Not a spoon was left in the castle.
Hang the holly high, bright its berries greeting, God in kindness.
The Thin Santa Claus, or The Christmas Yard That Was a Christmas Stocking, by Ellis Parker Butler. Mrs. Gratz opened her eyes and looked out at the drizzle that made the Christmas morning gray. Her bed stood against the window, and it was easy for her to look out. All she had to do was to roll over and pull the shade aside. Having looked at the weather, she rolled again onto the broad flat of her back and made herself comfortable for a while, for there was no reason why she should get up until she felt like it.
"Such a Christmas,"
she said good-naturedly to herself.
"I guess such weathers is bad for Santy Claus. Maybe it is because of such weathers he don't come by my house. I don't blame him. So muddy."
She let her eyes close indolently. Not yet was she hungry enough to imagine the tempting odor of fried bacon and eggs, and she idly slipped into sleep again. She was in no hurry. She was never in a hurry. What is the use of being in a hurry when you own a good little house and have money in the bank and are a widow? What is the use of being in a hurry anyway? Mrs. Gratz was always placid and fat, and she always had been. What is the use of having money in the bank and a good little house if you are not placid and fat? Mrs. Gratz lay on her back and slept, placidly and fatly, with her mouth open, as if she expected Santa Claus to pass by and drop a present into it. Her dreams were pleasant. It was no disappointment to Mrs. Gratz that Santa Claus had not come to her house. She had not expected him. She did not even believe in him.
Yes,
she had told Mrs. Flannery next door, as she handed a little parcel of toys over the fence for the little Flannerys.
Once I believes in such a Santa Claus myself yet. I make me pretty good times then, but now I'm too old. I don't believe in such things, but I make pretty good times still. I have a good little house and money in the bank.
Suddenly Mrs. Gratz closed her mouth and opened her eyes. She smelled imaginary bacon frying. She felt real hunger, and slid out of bed and began to dress herself, and she had just buttoned her red flannel petticoat around her wide waist when she heard a silence, and paused. For a full minute she stood, trying to realize what the silence meant. The English sparrows were chirping as usual and making enough noise, but through their bickerings the silence still annoyed Mrs. Gratz, and then, quite suddenly again, she knew. Her chickens were not making their usual morning racket.
I bet you I know what it is, sure,
she said, and continued to dress as placidly as before. When she went down, she found that she had won the bet. A week before, 2 chickens had been stolen from her coop, and she had had a strong padlock put on the chicken house. Now the padlock was pried open, and the chicken house was empty, and 9 hens and a rooster were gone. Mrs. Gratz stooped and entered the low gate and surveyed the vacant chicken yard placidly. If they were gone, they were gone.
Such a Santy Claus,
she said good-naturedly.
I don't like such a Santy Claus taking away and not bringing. Pretty soon he don't have such a good name any more if he keeps up doing like this. People likes the bringing Santy Claus. I guess they don't think much of the taking away business. He gets a bad name quick enough if he does this much.
She turned to bend her head to look into the vacant chicken house, and stood still. She put out her foot and touched something her eyes had lighted upon, and the thing moved. It was a purse of worn black leather, soaked by the drizzle, but still holding the bend that comes to men's purses when worn long in a back trouser pocket. One end of the purse was muddy and pressed deep into the soft soil where a heel was tramped on it. Mrs. Gratz bent and picked it up. There was $900 in bills in the purse. Mrs. Gratz stood still while she counted the bills, and as she counted her hands began to tremble, and her knees shook, and she sank on the door-sill of the chicken house and laughed until the tears rolled down her face. Occasionally she stopped to wipe her eyes, and the flood of laughter gradually died away into ripples of intermittent giggles that were like sobs after sorrow. Mrs. Gratz had no great sense of humor, but she could see the fun of finding $900. It was enough to make her laugh, so she laughed.
Goodness, such a Santy Claus,
she exclaimed with a final sigh of pleasure.
Such a Christmas present from Santy Claus. No wonder he is so fat yet when he eats 10 chickens in one night already, but I don't kick. I like me that Santy Claus all right. I believes in him pretty good after this, I bet.
She went at once to tell Mrs. Flannery, and Mrs. Flannery was far more excited about it than Mrs. Gratz had been. She said it was the hand of retribution paying back the chicken thief, and the hand of justice repaying Mrs. Gratz for sending toys to the little Flannerys, and pure luck giving Mrs. Gratz what she always got, and a number of other things.
"'Tis the luck of you, Mrs. Gratz, ma'am,"
she said.
"And often I do be saying, it is the Dutch for luck, meaning no disrespect to you. And the fatter the luckier, as I often told me old man, 'tis soul. And him so thin. And Christmas morning at that, ma'am. Which is nothing at all but the judgment of heaven on the dirty chicken thief, picking such a day for his thieving, when there's plenty other days in the year for him. Keep the money, ma'am, for 'tis yours by good rights. And I knew there'd be some good come till you the minute you handed me the presents for the kids. The good folks sure all gets their reward in this world, only some don't. And I'm only sorry mine is a pig instead of chickens. But not wishing you had the money yourself at all, but who would come to steal a pig? And them such loud squealers. And who do you suspicion it was, Mrs. Gratz, ma'am?
I think maybe I got me a present from Santa Claus, yes?
said Mrs. Gratz.
And hear the woman,
said Mrs. Flannery.
D'ye hear that now? Well, true for you, ma'am, and stick to it. There's no telling who'll be claiming the money. And if ever Santa Claus brought a thing to a mortal soul, 'twas him brought you that. And 'twas only yesterday you were saying you'd no belief in him.
Yesterday I don't have no beliefs in him,
said Mrs. Gratz.
Today I have plenty of beliefs in him. I like him plenty. I don't care if he comes every year.
Sure not,
said Mrs. Flannery.
And you with the $900 in your pocket, I'd be glad of the chance. I'd believe in him myself for $450.
That afternoon, Mrs. Flannery, whose excitement had not abated in the least, went over to Mrs. Gratz to spend the afternoon talking to her about the money. She felt that it was good to be that near it, at any rate, and when one can make a whole afternoon's conversation out of what Mrs. Casey said to Mrs. O'Reilly about Mrs. McNeely, it is a shame to miss a chance to talk about $900. Mrs. Flannery was rocking violently and talking rapidly, and Mrs. Gratz was slowly moving her rocker and answering in monosyllables, when someone knocked at the door. Mrs. Gratz answered the knock. Her visitor was a tall, thin man, and he had a slouch hat, which he held in his hands as he talked. He seemed nervous, and his face wore a worried look, extremely worried. He looked like a man who had lost $900, but he did not look like Santa Claus. He was thinner and not so jolly-looking. At first Mrs. Gratz had no idea that Santa Claus was standing before her, for he did not have a sleigh bell about him, and he had left his red cotton coat with the white batting trimming at home. He stood in the door playing with his hat, unable to speak. He seemed to have some delicacy about beginning.
Well, what is it?
said Mrs. Gratz. Her visitor pulled himself together with an effort.
Well, ma'am, I'll tell you,
he said frankly.
I'm a chicken buyer. I buy chickens. That's my business, dealing in poultry. So I came out today to buy some chickens.
On Christmas Day?
asked Mrs. Gratz.
Well,
said the man, moving uneasily from one foot to the other.
I did come on Christmas Day, didn't I? I don't deny that, ma'am. I did come on Christmas Day. I'd like to go out and have a look at your chickens.
It ain't so usual for buyers to come buying chickens on Christmas Day, is it?
interposed Mrs. Gratz good-naturedly.
Well, no, it ain't, and that's a fact,
said the man uneasily.
But I always do. The people I buy chickens for is just as apt to want to eat chicken one day as another day, and more so. Turkey on Christmas Day and chicken the next for a change. That's what they always tells me. So I have to buy chickens every day. I hate to, but I have to, and if I could just go out and look around your chicken yard.
It was right there that Mrs. Gratz had a suspicion that Santa Claus stood before her.
But I don't sell such a chicken yard yet,
she said. The man wiped his forehead.
Sure not,
he said nervously.
I was going to say look around your chicken yard and see the chickens. I can't buy chickens without I see them, can I? Some folks might, but I can't with the kind of customers I've got. I've got mighty particular customers, and I pay extra prices so as to get the best for them. And when I go out and look around the chicken yard...
How much you pay for such nice, big, fat chickens, maybe?
asked Mrs. Gratz.
Well, I'll tell you,
said the man.
7 cents a pound is regular, ain't it? Well, I pay 12. I'll give you 12 cents and pay you right now and take all the chickens you've got. That's my rule. But if you want to let me go out and see the chickens first and pick out the kind my regular customers like, I pay 20 cents a pound. But I won't pay 20 cents without I can see the chickens first.
Sure,
said Mrs. Gratz.
I wouldn't do it too. Maybe I go out and bring in a couple such chickens for you to look at, yes?
No, don't,
said the man impulsively.
Don't do it. It wouldn't be no good. I've got to see the chickens on the hoof, as I might say.
On the hoofs?
Said Mrs. Gratz.
Such poultry don't have no hoofs.
Running around,
explained the visitor.
Running around in the coop. I can tell if a chicken has got any disease that my trade wouldn't like if I see it running around in the coop. There's a lot in the way a chicken runs, in the way it hisses up its legs, for instance. That's what the trade calls it, on the hoof. So I'll just go out and have a look around the coop.
For 20 cents a pound, anybody could let buyers see their chickens on the hoof, I guess,
said Mrs. Gratz.
Now, that's the way to talk,
exclaimed the man.
Only I ain't got any such chickens,
said Mrs. Gratz.
So it ain't of use to look how they walk. So goodbye.
Now, say,
said the man, but Mrs. Gratz closed the door in his face.
I guess such a Santa Claus come back yet,
said Mrs. Gratz when she went into the room where Mrs. Flannery was sitting.
But it ain't any use. He don't leave many more such presents.
The impudence of him,
exclaimed Mrs. Flannery.
For $900 I could be impudent too,
said Mrs. Gratz calmly.
But I don't like such nowadays Santa Clauses coming back all the time. Once, when I believes in Santa Clauses, they don't come back so much.
The thin Santa Claus had not gone far. He had crossed the street and stood gazing at Mrs. Gratz's door, and now he crossed again and knocked. Mrs. Gratz arose and went to the door.
I believe he comes back once yet,
she said to Mrs. Flannery, and opened the door. He had indeed come back.
Now see here,
he said briskly.
Ain't your name Mrs. Gratz? Well, I knowed it was, and I knowed you was a widow lady, and that's why I said I was a chicken buyer. I didn't want to frighten you, but I ain't no chicken buyer.
No?
asked Mrs. Gratz.
No, I ain't. I just said that so I could get a look at your chicken yard. I've got to see it. What I am is chicken house inspector for the 9th Ward, and the mayor sent me up here to inspect your chicken house, and I've got to do it before I go away or lose my job. I'll go right out now, and it'll be all over in a minute.
I guess it ain't some use,
said Mrs. Gratz.
I guess I don't keep any more chickens. They go too easy. Yesterday I have plenty, and today I haven't any.
That's it,
said the thin Santa Claus.
That's just it. That's the way tuberculosis bugs act, quick like that. They're a bad epidemic, tuberculosis bugs is. You see how they act. Yesterday you have chickens, and last night the tuberculosis bugs gets at them, and this morning they've eat them all up.
Goodness,
exclaimed Mrs. Gratz without emotion.
With the feathers and the bones, too?
Sure,
said the thin Santa Claus.
Why, them tuberculosis bugs is perfectly ravenous. Once they get started, they eat feathers and bones and feet and all. A chicken hasn't no chance at all. That's why the mayor sent me up here. He heard all your chickens was gone, and gone quick, and he says to me, tuberculosis bugs, that's what he says, and he says, you ain't doing your duty. You ain't inspecting Mrs. Gratz's chicken coop. You go and do it, or you're fired, see? He says that, and he says, you inspect Mrs. Gratz's coop, and you kill off them bugs before they get into her house and eat her all up, bones and all.
And feathers?
asked Mrs. Gratz calmly.
No, he didn't say feathers. This ain't nothing to fool about. It's serious. So I'll go right out and have a look.
I guess such bugs ain't been in my coop last night,
said Mrs. Gratz carelessly.
I ain't afraid of such bugs in winter time.
Well, that's where you make your mistake,
said the thin Santa Claus.
Winter is just the bad time for them bugs. The more a tuberculosis bug freezes up, the more dangerous it is. In summer they ain't so bad. They're soft-like and squash up when a chicken gets them. But in winter they freeze up hard and get brittle. Then a chicken comes along and grabs one, and it busts into 1,000 pieces, and each piece turns into a new tuberculosis bug and busts into 1,000 pieces and so on, and the chicken gets all filled full of tuberculosis bugs before it knows it. When a chicken snaps up one tuberculosis bug, it has 1,000,000 in it inside of half an hour, and that chicken don't last long. And when the bugs make for the house, what's that on your dress there now?
Mrs. Gratz looked at her arm indifferently.
Nothing,
she said.
I thought maybe it was a tuberculosis bug had got on you already,
said the thin Santa Claus.
If it was, you would be all eat up inside of half an hour. Them bugs is awful rapacious.
Yes?
Inquired Mrs. Gratz with interest.
Such strong bugs, too, is it not?
You bet they are strong,
began the stranger.
I should think so,
interrupted Mrs. Gratz.
to smash up padlocks on such chicken houses. You make me afraid of such bugs. I don't dare let you go out there to get your bones and feet all eat up by them. I guess not.
Well, you see,
said the thin Santa Claus, puzzled, and then he cheered up.
You see, I ain't afraid of them. I've been fumigated against them. Fumigated and antisepticized. I've been vaccinated against them by the Board of Health. I'll show you the mark on my arm if you want to see it.
No, don't,
said Mrs. Gratz.
I let you go and look in that chicken coop if you want to, but it ain't no use. There ain't nothing there.
The thin Santa Claus paused and looked at Mrs. Gratz with suspicion.
Why, did you find it?
He asked.
Find what?
Asked Mrs. Gratz innocently, and the thin Santa Claus sighed and walked around to the back of the house. Mrs. Gratz went with him. As Mrs. Gratz watched the thin man search the chicken yard for tuberculosis bugs, all doubt that he was her Santa Claus left her mind. He made a most minute investigation, but he did it more as a man might search for a lost purse than as a health officer would search for germs. He even got down on his hands and knees and poked under the chicken house with a stick, and when he had combed the chicken yard thoroughly and had looked all through the chicken house, he even searched the denuded vegetable garden in the backyard and looked over the fence into Mrs. Flannery's yard. Evidently he was not pleased with his investigation, for he did not even say good-bye to Mrs. Gratz, but went away looking mad and cross. When Mrs. Gratz went into her house, she took her seat in her rocking-chair and began rocking herself calmly and slowly.
"'T was him done it, sure,"
said Mrs. Flannery.
I don't like such come-agains much,
said Mrs. Gratz placidly.
I try me to believe in such a Santa Claus, but I like not such come-agains. In Germany did not Santa Claus come back so much. I don't like a Santa Claus should be so anxious. Still I believes in him, but if he has too many such come-agains, I don't believe in him much.
"I would be setting the place on him. Santa Claus or no Santa Claus,"
said Mrs. Flannery vindictively.
"The mean chicken thief."
Oh,
said Mrs. Gratz easily.
I guess I don't care much. Should a $900 Santa Claus steal some chickens, I ain't mad.
But she was a little provoked when another knock came at the door a few minutes later, and when, on opening it, she saw the thin Santa Claus before her again.
So,
she said,
Santa Claus is back yet once.
What's that?
asked the man suspiciously.
I say, what is it you want?
said Mrs. Gratz.
Oh,
said the man.
Well, I ain't a-going to fool with you no longer, Mrs. Gratz. I'm a-going to tell you right out what I am and who I am. I'm a detective of the police, and I'm looking up a mighty bad character.
I guess I know right where you find one,
said Mrs. Gratz politely.
Now, don't be funny,
said the thin Santa Claus peevishly.
Maybe you noticed I didn't say nothing when you spoke about that padlock being busted. Maybe you noticed how careful I looked over your chicken coop and how I looked over the fence into the next yard? Well, I won't fool you. I ain't no chicken yard inspector, and I ain't no chicken buyer. Them was just my detective disguises. I'm out detecting a chicken thief, just a plain, ordinary chicken thief, and what I come for is clues.
Yes,
said Mrs. Gratz.
And what is it, such clues? I haven't any clueses.
The thin Santa Claus seemed provoked.
Now look here,
he said.
You may think this is funny, but it isn't. I have got to catch that chicken thief or I'll lose my job, and I can't catch him unless I have some clues to catch him with. Now, didn't you have some chickens stolen last night?
Chickens?
asked Mrs. Gratz.
No, I didn't have chickens stolen. Such tuberculosis bugs eat them, with feathers too, and bones, right off the hoofs. Ain't it a pity?
It may have been a blush of shame, but it was more like a flush of anger that overspread the face of the thin Santa Claus. He stared hard at the placid German face of Mrs. Gratz and decided she was too stupid to mean it, that she was not teasing him.
You don't catch on,
he said.
You see, there ain't any such things as tuberculosis bugs. I just made that up as sort of detective disguise. Them chickens wasn't eat by no bugs at all. They was stole, see? A chicken thief come right into the coop and stole them. Do you think any kind of bug could pry off a padlock?
Mrs. Gratz seemed to let this sink into her mind and to revolve there and get to feeling at home before she answered.
No,
she said at length.
I guess not. But Santa Claus could do it. Such a big fat man. Sure he could do it.
Why, you...
began the thin man crossly, and then changed his tone.
There ain't no such thing as Santa Claus,
he said as one might speak to a child. But even a chicken thief would not tell a child such a thing, I hope.
No?
queried Mrs. Gratz sadly.
No Santa Claus? And I was scared of it myself, with such tuberculosis bugs around. He should not to have gone into such a chicken coop with so many bugs busting up all over. He had a right to have fumigated himself once. And now he ain't. He's all eat up, on the hoof, bones and feet and all. And such a kind man, too.
The thin Santa Claus frowned. He had half an idea that Mrs. Gratz was fooling with him. And when he spoke, it was crisply.
Now see here,
he said.
Last night somebody broke into your chicken coop and stole all your chickens. I know that. And he's been stealing chickens all round this town and all round this part of the country, too. And I know that. And this stealing has got to stop. I've got to catch that thief. And to catch him, I've got to have a clue. A clue is something he has left around or dropped where he was stealing. Now, did that chicken thief drop any clues in your chicken yard? That's what I want to know. Did he drop any clues?
Maybe if he dropped some clues, those tuberculosis bugs eat them up,
suggested Mrs. Gratz.
They eats bones and feathers. Maybe they eat clues, too.
Now, ain't that smart?
Sneered the thin Santa Claus.
Don't you think you're funny? But I'll tell you the clue I'm looking for. Did that thief drop a pocketbook or anything like that?
Oh, a pocketbook,
said Mrs. Gratz.
How much should be in such a pocketbook, maybe?
$900,
said the thin Santa Claus promptly.
Goodness,
exclaimed Mrs. Gratz.
So much money all in one clues. Come out to the chicken yard once. I'll help hunt for clues, too.
The thin Santa Claus stood a minute looking doubtfully at Mrs. Gratz. Her face was large and placid and unemotional.
Well,
he said with a sigh,
it ain't much use, but I'll try it again.
When he had gone, after another close search of the chicken yard and coop, Mrs. Gratz returned to her friend Mrs. Flannery.
Purty soon I don't believe any more in Santa Claus at all,
she said.
Purty soon I have more beliefs in chicken thieves than in Santa Claus. Yet a while I beliefs in him, but one more of those come-agains and I don't.
He'll not be coming back any more,
said Mrs. Flannery positively.
I'm wondering he came at all. The jail's so handy. All you have to do is call a cop.
Sure,
said Mrs. Gratz.
But it is not nice I should put Santa Claus in jail. Such a liberal Santa Claus, too.
Have it your own way, ma'am,
said Mrs. Flannery.
I'll own 'tis some different when chickens are stole. 'Tis hard to expend the affections on a bunch of chickens. But if anyone was to steal my pig, to jail he would go. Santa Claus or no Santa Claus, not but what you have a kind heart anyway, ma'am. Not wanting to put the poor fella in jail. But he's already lost $900, which, goodness knows, you might have to hand back, was the law to take hand on it.
So,
said Mrs. Gratz.
Such is the law yet? All right, I don't believe in chicken thieves, no matter how much he comes back again. I stick me to Santa Claus. Always will I believe in Santa Claus. Chicken thieves gives, and wants to take away again, but Santa Claus is always giving and never taking.
You're forgetting the chickens that was took,
suggested Mrs. Flannery.
Took?
said Mrs. Gratz.
Tooken,
Mrs. Flannery corrected.
Tooked?
Said Mrs. Gratz.
I believes me not in Santa Claus that way. I believes he is a good old man. For givings, I believes in Santa Claus, but for takings, I believes in tuberculosis bugs.
and the busted padlock, then?
Asked Mrs. Flannery.
Ach,
Exclaimed Mrs. Gratz.
them reindeers is so frisky yet. They have a right to kick up and bust it, mebbe.
Mrs. Flannery sighed.
'Tis a grand thing to have faith, ma'am.
She said.
Yes,
Said Mrs. Gratz indolently.
that's nice. And it is nice to have $900 more in the bank, ain't it?
A Christmas Present Assurance Company by C.H. Grinling. I was so worn out when I got home on the Saturday before Christmas Day that I was obliged to go straight off to bed. You see, I had been out shopping all day, buying Christmas presents. It is an old custom in our family, always to give every member a present at Christmas time. It is not the price of the gift we value so much as the affectionate spirit which it shows. And yet, for all that, we are, every one of us, always more touchy after our Christmas shopping than at any other time in the year. Indeed, it was to escape from the general irritation, just as much as from over-fatigue, that I was glad to get off to bed early that evening. I fell asleep directly I got between the blankets, and presently I dreamed the most extraordinary dream. In the first place, I dreamed that I was an old and valued contributor to the public press, a sufficiently wild idea, considering that I have at home a large box full of manuscripts returned with the editor's compliments and regrets. Then I found myself entering an office, on the door of which was inscribed, "The Christmas, Wedding, and Birthday Present Assurance Company." The manager of the company received me cordially. "Yes," he said, in reply to my queries, and then at once it flashed upon me that I must be interviewing him for an article. "Yes, the idea of our company has caught on, and we are doing a rattling business already." "What precisely is the object of your business?" I inquired, or at least I dreamt I did, and I remember feeling pleased that I was doing this thing in the right style. "Why, to save people the trouble and expense of buying Christmas, birthday, and wedding presents," was the reply. "You see, everyone has to give such gifts nowadays, and to people with many relations and friends it is becoming an important item of expenditure, as well as a serious call on their time. You know how you feel yourself when Christmas is drawing near, or a friend is going to be married, or a birthday in the family is approaching. You say to yourself, I must give so-and-so a present, but I'm sure I don't know what to get, and I really can't afford the time just now to spend half a day ransacking the shops. And so you put the thing off till it can't be postponed any longer. Then you go, in desperation, into the first shop you come to, and either spend twice as much as you meant to, or buy something which you are ashamed to send." "Yes, that's so," I said, "but how do you propose to help me?" "By taking the whole thing off your hands. You take out a policy with us, pay a year's premium, and we choose and pay for the presents you have occasion to give in the year." "But who judges what I ought to give?" I asked, remembering how long I had discussed with myself whether my wife's aunt would be offended if I left her out this year. "Oh, trust that to us. We have experts in etiquette who can decide these points to a nicety. Now, suppose you want a general policy covering all sorts of presents. Well, you are a middle-class man with a small family, a moderate number of relations, and a not very large circle of middle-class friends. Our actuary would probably estimate our risk at taking you at about £15 per annum. For that we should undertake to give your wife and children each 2 suitable presents during the year, Christmas and birthday. Then we should give 1 present each, probably at Christmas, to 6 selected relations annually. We should also send wedding presents to such of your friends as might be married during the year." "That last would be an uncertain item, would it not?" I queried. "A little so, perhaps, but 1 year balances another. You see, we have a very strict set of rules, drawn up by a committee of authors of etiquette primers, as to what persons are called upon to give one another wedding presents. When you want us to send a wedding gift on your behalf, you would have to prove either that the bridegroom or bride had given such a present to you or your wife, or that you were in the habit of taking at least 1 meal in a month in the house of the parents of one or other of the happy pair. Afternoon teas don't count as meals. In the case of old schoolfellows, we don't admit liability unless an uninterrupted correspondence has been maintained since separation. In the case of ladies, we require at least monthly letters. We have not so far had an instance of a man wishing us to give a present to an old school chum." "And do I have no voice in the selection of the gifts?" I asked. "You may, if you like, within certain fixed limits, but we recommend our clients to leave the matter entirely in our hands. You see, from our large experience, we are thoroughly qualified to decide matters of the greatest delicacy. Already we have statistics carefully compiled, which show the precise age to a month at which rattles and india-rubber suckers begin to pall on infants, and we can also advise with confidence as to when it is safe to entrust young children with tin soldiers, mechanical toys, etc., which it would do them harm to suck or swallow. In cases of special difficulty, we usually ask for photographs of the recipients. By a glance at a boy's tie or boots, we can always tell whether he will most appreciate a book or a Malacca cane, and if a girl has her hair up, we know we are safe in sending gloves or trinkets." "Do the gifts you send usually give satisfaction?" "In nearly all instances. You see, our experience is so valuable in delicate cases, such as mothers-in-law and maiden aunts. We never commit the common blunder of giving such ladies a costly present 1 year and nothing the next. More family quarrels are caused by the sudden stopping of presents previously given than by not making any gifts at all. But perhaps you would like to see our storerooms. Walk this way." I followed my guide into a large warehouse, which had all the appearances of a fancy fair. One counter looked like a toy shop, another resembled a tobacconist's, a third a bookseller's, and so on. In the children's section I found a very large assortment of most ingenious mechanical toys and puzzles, but I looked in vain for the Noah's Arks, picture books, and fairy tales, which so delighted my own childhood. "Have children's tastes changed so?" I asked, with reference to these. "No," was the reply. "The children still like them. But nowadays toys, like pantomimes and circuses, though ostensibly for the children, have to interest and amuse the parents as well. This toy music hall, for example, with its automatic skirt dancers and knockabout artistes, is a very popular line, and so are these musical boxes, which play all the latest coster songs. Both of those are presents sure to give satisfaction in cases of children from 1 year old upwards. But come this way, and I will show you our latest development." So saying, the manager led me into an adjoining room, which, to my amazement, I found filled with such articles as coal scuttles, saucepans, brooms, basins, and ewers, and other miscellaneous domestic utensils. "What?" I exclaimed. "You don't mean to say that people give useful things like these as presents? Why, the millennium must be approaching." The manager smiled. "No," he said, This is a separate undertaking from the present assurance. We call this the Wedding Present Clearing House. All the articles you see on this shelf are marked equivalent to salad bowls. Now, a salad bowl is a very favorite article for a wedding present. You see, it is handsome and genteel, and not too expensive, and it looks well in a printed list of gifts. The result is that it is not an uncommon thing for a young married couple to receive from 10 to 20 of these bowls. Well, one salad bowl is quite sufficient for a family of 2 persons, even if they are vegetarians. So something must be done with the others. Some ladies make them up into flower vases, but many now bring them to us and exchange them for any of the useful articles on this shelf, which they may be in need of. We are glad of the bowls, which we send out again in our next batch of wedding gifts. The articles on the next shelf are a better class of goods. We give them in exchange for silver candlesticks or side dishes, of which young couples usually have a large surplus. "I wish your clearing-house had been in existence when I married," I exclaimed, with a distant recollection of a number of silver articles which my wife put away years ago in tissue paper, and which now never saw the light. "Perhaps even now it is not too late. What do you say, Madeline, my dear?" I said to my wife, who now seemed to be by my side. "What's that you're talking about?" came the reply in my wife's voice. "I asked you to go to the nursery to see what's the matter with the children. They've been crying for the last 10 minutes. I think one of them must have tumbled out of bed." I hurriedly pulled on some clothes and sallied forth. I found my 2 youngsters sitting on their bed and howling. It appeared they had got up in the middle of the night to see what Santa Claus had put in their stockings, and they were weeping because there was only 1 layer in the boxes of chocolates instead of 2 like last year. I comforted them with promises of another box each, and went back to bed. "It's disgraceful," I said to my wife, "and I shall write to the company about it tomorrow morning." Madeline stared at me, and then I remembered that I had bought the chocolates myself at a bargain at the confectioner's round the corner, and that the Christmas, wedding, and birthday present assurance company was only a dream.
If you like what you hear, please leave us a review on iTunes, like us on Facebook. You can download our app for iOS devices, Android devices, Windows phones. You can listen to CraftLit on Stitcher Radio, iHeartRadio, Google Play Music. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.